It's good to see all of you here. It's definitely more people than I expected because this is a pretty focused conversation. But I'm going to try to keep it pretty informal, especially because I think a lot of people here already are in the space. So it's really reiterating something that people know, or I'm going to give like a one-on-one level conversation. And to those people, hopefully it adds some value as well. Um, as Stan mentioned a few minutes ago, my name is Darshan. I am an attorney, but I'm also a pharmacist. I work with law firms. I help work with service providers, investment bankers, in doing due diligence, specifically regulatory due diligence for FDA-regulated companies. The agenda, as I see it, is the following: first, talk about why is regulatory due diligence important. Then get into what are the elements of regulatory due diligence. Then talk about what does post due diligence look like, and then finally talk about post transaction. So let's start with the first one. Why is it important? So the key piece, as I see it, and I know there are actual service providers on here who do their own version of M&A due diligence. So to the extent you either disagree with me or you have something to add, love to have you be part of the conversation. I think the goal is to be interactive as we continue. But I think there are four major areas. There's the contractual, there's the regulatory, there's the administrative, and the legal, all of which are reasons why it's important. Speaking from a contractual level, obviously, if you do appropriate if you do appropriate due diligence, it's going to have an impact on the contract you actually land up writing, because what you land up finding are the pieces that seem to be problematic, and the other side will say that they're not problematic inevitably, or that you think needs to be addressed in the holdback that you might look at, etc. So from a pure contractual perspective, you want to have that. Alternatively, if you are the one selling the company, you might want to have specific carve-outs saying, I have provided you with all this information. You don't get to come back to me after the fact and tell me I didn't disclose. So speaking from a regulatory due diligence standpoint, as the buyer, I want complete transparency. As the seller, I want complete transparency, but for completely different reasons. As the buyer, I want complete transparency because I know what I'm buying. As the seller, I want complete transparency because if the buyer comes back later on going, you didn't disclose this, it's very clear that it did. You can see in the due diligence room and go from there. From the regulatory perspective, the FDA is one of the agencies. I know some people on here actually do privacy work. So privacy is another area. Compliance is another. And we're going to talk about a little bit with all of those. And that sort of from a regulatory administrative standpoint, those are the areas we're getting into specifically. And we're going to go do deeper dives into each of these. But regulatory, we're thinking about FDA, obviously, but we are thinking about things like OCR. We are thinking about, so OCR is where HIPAA comes from. You might have state regulators that might be looking in. Just sort of beating myself to the punch. What you'll notice is that almost inevitably, if you are in the middle of a buy-sell transaction and it involves a pharma company or a food company or a device company, they have almost never registered with the state boards. They didn't even know that they had to do that. The State Board of Pharmacy often requires you to register with them if you are a manufacturer, and the word manufacturer is not intuitive. Some people think that the word manufacturer simply means you made products in that state, and that's great. That's one definition. That's not how all states see it. You'll see states that'll go, if your product comes into my state and you made it in Florida, we are in California, we still expect you to register here. I'm just picking two states. I'm not saying either one of their laws requires that. There's a state level. Like I said, there is also FDA, and we'll talk about that. There are distinct areas you could be looking at. And we'll go into each one of these separately. So let's dig into it a little bit closer. Contractual, if you have violations, obviously you will be looking at financial damage. So you could be looking at compensatory or punitive. So if you did not appropriately disclose, you might be in a situation where you're primarily looking at compensatory, paying that money back. Specific performance is the alternative. That's when you go to court, you tell a judge, you know what, we need this person to act in this specific way because it's in the contract. We want to have it. We had it specifically carved out, and that's what we want. And the judge will look at the contract, will look at what you guys agreed to, and use that. From a regulatory standpoint, as I was mentioning, you've got 5 major areas that come into play. You've got the FDA might say, we want to approve your products. You've got specific corrective or preventative actions you may need to take. The FDA may come in and say that, you know what, here's the letter saying that we don't like what you did. They can escalate that into warning letters. And then finally, you could be looking at a product recall, each of which obviously is from a pure FDA standpoint concerning. You want to be able to fix this. You want, when you're doing the due diligence, you want to look in and go, okay, I've looked at this. I understand what their title letters are, what their untitled letters are, and come back out and go, what have you done to fix this? So the problem is not that there were errors made, and this is something that people seem to misunderstand. You're not looking for a perfect company. That doesn't exist. In fact, if I see a perfect company, I don't believe you. I'm looking for a company that I see Don smiling. Has that been your experience, Don?
Well, in the world, have you ever seen a clinical trial that goes perfect? No.
Exactly.
So
exactly. Yeah. And that's my point. You don't want a company that is only showing you its best face. Because if you do, you know that they're hiding something much, much worse at that point. I want to have a conversation where I go, okay, we found this problem. Here's what we're doing to fix it. And show me that you understand what a root cause analysis is, which means that you dug in deep, you found out what is causing this problem, and then you had a CAPA being a corrective action and a preventative action. And what does that actually mean? That means you went in and you actually fixed things that were immediately problematic, and then fixed things that were that caused the immediate problem. So let me give you an example. If you're talking on manufacturing, let's say you had lab samples that were kept out and someone saw those lab samples outside. People make mistakes, that's fine. So what was your corrective action? Let's say those lab samples needed to be refrigerated. Well, put them back in the refrigerator. Great, you have a corrective action. Preventative action, what caused that person to keep that lab sample outside? Was it lack of training? And everyone, here's the funny thing, everyone's gonna blame training. It's the fact that you're going to do training 15 times. It doesn't take. Maybe it's not the training. Maybe it's the fact that, and I see Stan smiling at this point. He's seen a million of the training ones, hasn't he?
I have, and the other one is I can't help but interject because you did ask for a little.
Please,
and
please.
I'll try to shut up later, but
no, not at all.
Sometimes there's a missing step in the CAPA, which is the immediate activity, the mitigation.
Right.
Like throw the samples out because they got damaged. And then the corrective action, which might be, I forgot to put a sign up, which isn't really a great solution, but anyway, it's a complicated topic. I don't mean to make it more complicated, but the immediate action, the mitigation, is often missed.
And I think that's the key component. I think, Stan, please continue to interject. Don, please continue to interject. Just to be clear, they're both showing up on my screen, which is why I'm picking on them. But if you guys want to talk, feel free to jump in. For example, I know Jeffrey's out there who I know can add a ton to this conversation as well, but he may be driving, etc. But the point being exactly what Stan's pointing to, this idea that we're going to just go, oh, you know what? We train people not to keep the lab samples out. Great. What happened to the lab sample that you had out? Oh, we put it back in. Is it still good? I don't know. Well, that's a problem. And that you didn't learn from that is a bigger issue. Mistakes happen. How you fix them, how you solve them is the bigger question. And then obviously getting into warning letters. Generally speaking, warning letters are when your untitled letters didn't take, which basically means that the FDA went, fix this, and you went, nah, and that's a problem. And that's when the FDA starts ratcheting things up. Alternatively, you will see warning letters when this guy's arm fell off and you forgot to report it. Well, that's a huge problem. The FDA can't just ignore that. That's when you'll see warning letters as well. And then you'll see product recalls. And product recalls for me are kind of interesting because it seems so simple. It seems like, you know what? All we're going to do is just go, everyone who has a drug, send it back to me. Well, that's not how that works. Because if you're a drug company, you don't want to be announcing to the world, my drug doesn't work, or there's a problem with the drug. So what you'll end up doing is, well, what level of recall are you doing? Do you have controls over who you send the product to? And when you do send the product, why do you think that level is correct? So, for example, you might say, I'm going to reach out to my wholesalers, the ones that I sold the product to, and go, send me anything you have back. Great. Alternatively, it might be they sent it to the pharmacy. Reach out to every single pharmacy they reached out to and ask for the product back. Alternatively, it could be it went to patients, and we don't want this product in patients' hands. We want the product back. Each of those is a level of product recall. Which level do you need? Something as simple as we use the wrong color dye. Well, it's not going to affect anything. Just ask for the product back, because there's a risk of there being a mistake. So the hazard is limited. You do what's called a hazard analysis. And this is the level of analysis. You want to see that those levels of controls in place, where the FDA can come back and go, okay, we saw what you did. You informed the FDA. We looked at the analysis, and we think we can fix the problem. We have everything under control. And that's what you're looking at. And that's what you're looking for. Okay, actually, this works. You could then also be looking at the following legal issues. You've got violations of corporate integrity agreements, which is your CIA, False Claims Act, Anti-Kickback Law, Stark, and Park Doctrine. Corporate integrity agreements, I'm going to have the next slide talk about this a little bit, but probably starting about 2010 or so, you saw this giant spike in actually 2008, I think is about right. You saw this giant spike in the government going after pharma companies for a variety of issues. You started seeing multi-billion-dollar fines coming out of the industry. Interestingly enough, they all came primarily out of the space of off-label marketing. But there have been 6 court cases, and well, actually more since then, and multiple sort of pushbacks, which has caused off-label marketing to become a little bit more contentious. And we can talk about that if that's of interest. But if you are doing appropriate due diligence, you want to know if these guys have a corporate integrity agreement, and what is the basis of the corporate integrity agreement between the pharma company and the government. And that's the type of analysis you want to do. You might find out that they are. I was just recently in a situation where we found out that the company was potentially going to have a corporate integrity agreement, and that was possibly one of the reasons that they might be interested in a possible sale. In that situation, you want to find out, well, what is the likelihood of a corporate integrity agreement? You might go, it's an agreement. Why does it matter? It's not the agreement itself that's the problem. It's the costs of maintaining that agreement that become a huge issue. You get what's called an IRO, an institutional review organization. They'll come in and oversee. The cost of keeping that IRO going is more than any work you have to do to fix things. So it's all a matter of what costs are you looking at? Can you fix the problem before you buy the company? Can you avoid the IRO? Can you avoid the CIA? And those are the conversations you want to have. Stan, I saw you smile there. Did you want to add something there? You're muted.
All right, thank you for that. Sorry. In my experience, I've actually dealt with one of those pretty recently, and in a consulting kind of capacity. And it's an amazing amount of overhead. There were actually more people working on review than there were working on the various CAPAs that were involved.
Exactly. And that's the thing. People don't realize that your IRO itself is a massive, massive cost. So if you can avoid it, that'd be great. False Claims Act. False claims, we can get into like a whole discussion on False Claims Act, and that's probably not the goal you want to go down. But essentially, it comes down to, are you causing false claims to be submitted to the government? That's really the question that comes up. This comes up in multiple different angles. It comes up in the context of clinical research. The DOJ actually pointed out in 2021 that they are targeting clinical research right now. So if you look at your settlements that have come out in the last year and a half to 2 years, there are a series of settlements involving clinical research sites that are involving pharmaceutical companies, all involving clinical research. There's a huge sort of uptick in that. And if anyone wants some links, I'm happy to send those to you as well. If you are looking at kickbacks, look at, for example, the fraud alert that came out from 2020 from this the OIG, the Office of Inspector General. They came out and said that we think that if you are having drug dinners in at Ruth Chris's, we think that's inherently a kickback, and we want you to actively think through whether this is something you want to do. So it's a per se concern, which most people aren't even aware that this fraud alert exists. So if you are in this space, if you are in pharma, by the way, if anyone needs to make a comment, please let me know, because I can't see any comments, but feel free to engage. But so there was this speaker fraud alert I mentioned in 2020. What's even more under the radar, which I think is fascinating, is if you are buying a company that does, for example, continuing medical education. Everyone thought continuing medical education was great, no problem at all. There's interaction. The FDA, we are two separate organizations. FDA is going to love us. Well, OIG has a problem with it. OIG actually wrote out an advisory opinion letter in 2022 saying that there are 4 ways to fund continuing medical education. Well, continuing education, 2 of those ways can be via drug companies. Both ways are concerning, which is hugely problematic. But people are trying to avoid. I've spoken to a couple of different CME companies about it, and they've taken the position of, let's put my head under the sand until it's an actual problem. I'm going to ignore it. Well, you have an advisory opinion. It is an actual problem, but something to consider. Stark, you'd think Stark doesn't even apply, because it really is. It deals with this idea that it's a law against self-referral. So I can't just go, I'm a doctor, I own a lab company, I'm going to refer people to the lab company. That's great. However, if you own the lab company, that becomes a violation of Stark, and you've got to be very, very careful about the types of referrals that you do. This becomes a huge issue because you're seeing more and more engagement between academic research organizations, specifically doctors working within them, will have a stake in the pharma company you're buying. Is there a concern? Has any of this analysis been done before? And as you start doing some of that deeper dive, you will see that Stark can kick into place as well. And then there's the Park Doctrine, which I think is fascinating because you don't actually need to, and it turns out people don't even know this thing exists. It came out of Philadelphia, from the Philly area. It was Acme Markets. And the idea was that the doctor was, the CEO was told by the FDA, look, your markets are dirty. You need to clean up. The CEO goes, oh, great. No problem. We'll take care of it. FDA came back, still not clean. FDA came back, still not clean. FDA came back, still not clean. They finally sued the CEO, saying, and you aren't fixing this. The guy goes, I'm the CEO. Do you think I'm really like cleaning Acme Markets? And they go, well, you're in a position where you could have affected that. You haven't affected that. We're holding you responsible. So you could have an actual felony and/or a misdemeanor resulting from the Park Doctrine. You personally could have an impact. Could be impacted, and that's something you need to be aware of. So if you are a buyer looking at an acquisition, are there any Park Doctrine concerns? There are legal principles that are similar called respondeat superior, but the same exact concept comes into play. If you're doing appropriate M&A due diligence, you should be considering each one of these as you continue. This is one of my favorite slides. This is a few years old, but it really demonstrates the types of fines we're talking about. 2008, you had 4.8 billion, 2010, 3.4 billion, all the way down. And this was 2017. I think that's when I pulled this one out. And it looks so minor, only $280 million in comparison, possibly, but it's so much money. And the fines are continuing to pile on. In fact, the DOJ continues to make health fraud a priority for them. So again, when you're going through the process of due diligence, what you want to start thinking about is, what are you going to look at? Are you going to look at corporate compliance, FDA, privacy? What is the scope of what you're going to look at? Each of these are different agencies, and each of them will come into play. Once you decide that, and I know some people on here are privacy experts, love to get their take on it. I start asking things like, okay, you're going to talk about corporate compliance. We talked about False Claims Act. We talked about the anti-kickback law. We talked about Stark. Which of those kick in? Do you want me to look at each one of them? You'll get companies, inevitably, the buyer goes, you don't need to look at any of them. Seller goes, I want you to look at all of them. And the analysis is what lands up mattering. And you want to dig in a little bit deeper. You want to find out, is there exposure? And sometimes you get really lucky, and the answer is we just had a OIG analysis, and we're fine. Here's a report that came out. Great. We don't need to dig in too deep because we already have the answer. On the other hand, the last time we don't have an attorney, we don't have a compliance person. The last time anyone looked at this was 2008. I definitely want to look closer. I've done this with companies where you find out that they don't have a compliance team. They don't have policies in place. They don't know that compliance is an issue. I was just involved in a merger associated with exactly that type of structure. And that's not surprising. The smaller companies don't. So if you are a larger company acquiring a smaller company, keep that in mind. You may have to you may have to build that culture into the company you're acquiring. Alternatively, if both companies have their own culture, how are you going to bring them together? Different compliance folks will have their own perspective. FDA, are you going to look at, and Dawn mentioned this a few minutes ago, clinical research is messy. Advertising is messy. Manufacturing is messy. Distribution is messy. Pharmacovigilance is messy. And anything else we keep digging deeper into is kind of messy. So what scope do you want me to look at? Each of those, I can spend it's a full-time job to look at just one of those. And you have multiple people doing multiple full-time jobs looking at each one of those issues. So asking someone to do a due diligence on all of those is problematic, because you're usually going to get maybe 15, 20, 30 days to do an analysis on a bunch of different things, including this. So what are you going to focus on, and why? That's a question you want to start thinking about. Privacy. Most pharma companies take the position, I'm not subject to privacy issues because we don't hold patient data. First of all, that's not true. You do hold patient data. The question is, where do you hold it? Do you have control? Are you in the US? Are you outside the US? Is GDPR a concern? Is CCPA a concern? Is CMEA a concern? And that's just California. We can get into Virginia. We can talk about Colorado, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So which laws do you want me to look at? And those are the types of scope issues you need to be thinking about. Again, once you've decided what you're going to look at, you're going to start deciding sort of what that process looks like. So you're going to have determined scope, then you're going to have a list of things you're going to look at. You're going to review those documents and finally create a summary. That's the entire pathway you're going to follow. So we talked about determining scope. When we create the due diligence checklist, I would advise you to sort of run it by the right people, make sure that they buy into it. What you might find in many cases is they'll go, you know what, that's why we're hiring you. I want you to decide if that's appropriate. And you're going to have to make some judgment calls, make sure you made appropriate disclosures, and keep going. You're going to review those documents and then finally create the summary. Make sure you have the appropriate disclaimers in place when you're creating the summary, because by definition, just because of the scope, there will be limitations to what you have reviewed and what you have not reviewed. We talked a little bit about corporate compliance. Again, remember that there are at least two separate agencies you may be looking at: the Office of Inspector General and the Department of Justice. They often work hand in hand. If you are a pharma company, they expect you, and this is coming from a 2003 guidance with OIG, they expect you to have effective lines of communication. They expect you to have an internal monitoring system. They expect you to have appropriate training and education. They want you to have a designated compliance officer and compliance team. And then they want you to have standards and relevant procedures. One of the key things I see as an error is that if you look at the designated compliance officer and compliance committee part, it's interesting to me that people will just say, we have a lawyer, that's the person. And that is understandable, but the DOJ has come out specifically and said, we don't want your lawyer being your compliance professional because it is a conflict of interest. Because the lawyer, by definition, has to protect your interest. They have to say, whatever the company does, it's defendable. That's the job of the lawyer. The compliance person is almost working, if you work in clinical research, they're working as the IRB. They're working as an independent person going, hey, guys, we need to stop this. And for exactly that reason, the DOJ wants this compliance person to directly report to the board. What you will often find is this idea that the compliance person is often a salesperson, and they're in charge of compliance. They've never done anything in compliance. I find myself as a lawyer educating these individuals, going, look, here's some things you need to have in place. And they're very, very nice, and they're very, very like smart, but you're thrust into a role you don't know enough about. And that sometimes worries me for you, because the company will push you to do things that, again, you might land up having exposure. And what you might find, you're seeing this in a lot of the settlements that are coming out, the compliance person is being held responsible as well. So keep your eye out for exactly that issue.
Darshan?
Yes.
Question. If it is a small kind of startup company,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on them employing kind of an outsourced or an fractional compliance officer, right?
I'm a strong advocate for that.
Okay.
I'm a strong advocate. Now, here's the funny part, right? What is the scope of this outsourced compliance officer? And what is the goal of it? Because sometimes that outsourced compliance officer is there just for show. They'll have 2 hours a month to do whatever you're going to do. And you go, can't do that much in 2 hours.
Yeah.
And what the DOJ and the OIG wants to see is that you're invested in compliance. You're not just giving sort of deference to the idea that we need something, but you're actually going in there and saying, we have the people, they have the means, and they have the power to actually make things happen. They have the budgets, positions. So if this person's outside, they don't know who the players are, they don't have the ability to run audits, well, that's a problem. On the other hand, if this is an outside person who he or she's doing all those things, but is an outside person, then that's typically not an issue. Is that responsive, Dawn?
Yes, thank you.
Has that been your experience, or do you have a different take?
No. I mean, I think it, when it's startup companies, it's tough, right? How do you, there's usually not that many individuals, especially at the executive level, right? Due to revenue and limited revenue, et cetera. How do you create that arm's length, right? To create reduce the risk and create the level of trust for these situations. And I agree with you. I've seen both situations, right? Just before maybe they're being looked at for a deal. Oh, they hire that compliance officer, right? Like you see, like once you get to the contract, you see this person's only been on board for 3 months.
Right.
But I agree with you. So, and again, I also think it's how strong is the underlying infrastructure of that company, even if it's a startup. If there's strong bones there and processes, that compliance officer can have limited interactions. So I think you're right. It's much better when the individual is a full-time, executive of the organization, but sometimes companies just can't do that.
Absolutely. And for better or for worse, compliance lands up being seen as a cost center. So you have to consider the implications of that. It's sort of like legal, or like insurance. They are there to help avoid costs. But are you driving the line forward? And I think that's what compliance professionals in general need to be doing, which is, instead of saying no, start educating on how. And I think that's a hard thing to do because as compliance professionals, it's easier to say no. It's easier to go. It's easier. It's a little harder to go, what are you trying to accomplish? Is this the best way to get there? And making sure, for example, that people are following your recommendations. Because if you're just a figurehead, which happens often enough, you're going to land up in a scenario where this person's opinions are being heard, but nothing's ever happening from them. And it goes back to these having the written procedures, and that, but are you going back and monitoring and auditing and making sure it's actually happening? So I find using the OIG system, but also if you look at the, I'll probably have a slide on it in a few seconds, on the Plan, Do, Check, Act system, using that process is useful as well. This is kind of interesting. Oops. People don't know that this exists. This came out in March 2023, so it's what, 7 months old. DOJ came out and they said that in the criminal division of the DOJ came out and said that if you are doing an M&A transaction, we want you to have a corporate compliance program, and we expect you to have that. A lot of people don't know that this exists. It came from the Department of Justice, from the criminal division of the Department of Justice. They then said that as part of that program, if you see people not doing their jobs properly, we want you to voluntarily self-disclose. We want you to tell people and tell on people. It's very Gestapo when they put it that way, but it is something. Stan's smiling, but it is something that is happening. The DOJ, OIG are expecting you to come and name names, because companies have overall just gone, well, we had a problem, we fixed it. Well, hold someone responsible. Well, we're not going to tell you who the name is. But this, for the last probably about 5 years, this has been the focus of conversations by the DOJ, OIG, and the like. And then they actually came out with a pilot program in March saying that, do your employment agreements have a compensation clawback clause, saying that we will look at new hires, and if you're not compliant, we will take your money back. So if you're doing an M&A analysis, you want to go back and evaluate whether these people are following the rules, and making sure that the employment agreements include a compensation clawback clause. So, for example, in our case, Zoe leads everything we do. Does Beacon have a compensation clawback clause going, Zoe, if you don't follow the rules, we're going to take your money back? And the answer is we don't, because we're not a pharmaceutical company. But it's a big enough issue at the CEO level, making an obscene amount of money to go, we want money back if this happens. And the DOJ expects you to have something in place. Talking a little bit about the corporate compliance programs, these are the three factors the DOJ wants you to look at. Is the corporation's compliance program well designed? Is it being applied earnestly and in good faith? In other words, is the program adequately resourced and empowered? And does it actually work in practice? So you had the first two, great. You basically bought a standard set of procedures. Well, does it actually work in practice? And the DOJ will keep looking for that. Similarly, when you're talking about the voluntary self-disclosure program, they are looking for the voluntary self-disclosure to be timely, voluntary, and voluntary self-disclosure. So again, just to be clear, Mark, thank you so much for staying on. I appreciate you staying on as long as you did. I know he has to run off. I think it's interesting that they talk about this timely and voluntary, because what's interesting is that if you don't self-disclose in time, the Department of Justice will say that we'll still go after you. And that's surprising and problematic for a lot of people going, well, I just disclosed everything to you. Well, not in time. Again, as I pointed out, they do want you to go after the employees. And if you do it right, the penalties can be a lot less. For example, they're saying that they'll give 50%, USAO, the U.S. Attorney's Office, will accord or recommend to a sentencing court at least 50% up to 75% reduction off the low end of the U.S. sentencing guidelines fine range. So it can be advantageous to actually self-disclose. Having said that, and I'm curious, Dawn and Stan, if Susan's asking, what does in time mean after the problem is discovered? Quickly is really what they're talking about. Susan, let's bring her on. Feel free to jump in, Susan.
Like, no, I'm just trying to clarify and nail down as much as possible. That's all.
Absolutely. So short version, what they're really saying is, look, you discovered this and now you are going to hide it. Well, and then you find out that DOJ might be looking at you. Well, by the time we're looking at you and you decide to come back, that's too late.
Yeah.
We want you to disclose things up front. We want you to tell us that there's a problem and be proactive about it. And that's what they are talking about when they say self-disclosure and they talk about in time. Is that responsive?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Because you'll often see this, which is let's hide it under the rug and see if nothing happens. And I'd say that is probably about 85% of the companies I know. They're going, let's see if we can fix the problem up front.
Yeah.
And I don't blame them, but we should know that there's an alternative.
Okay. Makes sense. Thanks.
Absolutely. Stan and Dawn, have you had different experiences with people?
I was in a company where the chief medical officer was he was structurally reporting to the senior VP of R&D instead of to the CEO, and the company pretty actively. In fact, I joined this company after all this bad stuff had happened, and the company pretty actively tried to suppress the chief medical officer's opinions and thoughts. So he went to the FDA, and became a whistleblower. And anyway, I got to join the company at about the time the FDA got really interested, and I helped get it all fixed. But this point about, basically, you can't really solve the problem by lying about it or hiding it. You got to get it open, and having that culture of openness is good. And I think probably all the companies we're used to have either internal or usually outsourced, like whistleblower lines, the if you think something is wrong, call this private number and report it. And I think that goes a long way as well.
Here's my question for you, Stan, though. In your experience, when you have those whistleblower lines, they exist, but do you find that they get taken seriously?
I don't think, the problem is that there's good and bad, right? I mean, I'm saying good things about them, but now I'll say bad things about them. They sort of suggest that there's something wrong with the culture of the company, that people aren't really able to tell the truth inside the company. So no, I don't know. I mean, I think it's a checkbox thing. You got to have one, but it's not. It's like necessary but not sufficient.
Fascinating. I've never thought of it that way. So you see it as an inherent sort of admission that there's a problem, and we just don't know what it is.
It's like we aren't really sure that we're good, so we'll set up this little safety net. And I don't know. I mean, again,
interesting.
I'm sure lots of people have opinions about this topic.
I think that's what we want, right? So something to not listen to me keep talking and droning on. Dawn, what's your experience?
From a company perspective, I've been lucky that the organizations that I've been with, ethically, compliance, all of these types of things, have always been in line. The only thing in terms of practice is, again, I would have agree with you, being in multiple FDA inspections, right? If, they're coming in for a specific sponsor or whatever the issue, or if it's just an annual audit, especially if it's just been from 3 years, similar to what Stan said, right? After they do their introduction and they sit down and they say, so what's been going on? You just lay it all out there, right? Because it's, folks they're trained, they're experienced, whether it's the IRS or the FDA or a different regulatory body, from the minute they walk in the door, they can sense, when something's being, swept under the rug, and it just, what it does is makes your life that much harder, because they're just going to keep digging and increase the scope of what they're going to do. So totally agree with you.
And I think the interesting part is, if you're buying a company that is either engaged in a voluntary self-disclosure or it is considering a voluntary self-disclosure. Again, it speaks to the fact that, okay, so we can start from a clean slate. And that is a helpful thought process as well. Again, recognize, let's sort of speak about both sides of this equation, right? It probably will cause a hit on your valuation.
So I was just going to say that, right? How does this, I mean, yeah, we can start with a blank slate, but for the seller,
right,
in this situation,
yeah,
I think it's going to be a huge hit. Not only will the buyer, have to want to decrease that valuation based on what it's going to cost to potentially fix it. But again, the buyer's going to say, what else, right? Hasn't this potential new partner not told us, that potentially my due diligence partner and stuff has found, might make the deal go away completely. So
I think it's a great point, but I would flip that. And again, it's a valid thought process, right? These are all, you're trying to look at human psychology. I would argue that if I'm doing a voluntary self-disclosure, it speaks to the fact that we don't hold information in. I would argue that the companies that I find problems with after the fact, after I start doing the due diligence and stuff of disclosure, are the ones I'm more worried about, because there are layers upon layers of things we're going to discover. On the other hand, a voluntary self-disclosure usually to me means you found something, you're very willing to be open about it. But my experience tends to be things have to hit the 90, 95 level mark before people are going to self-disclose. You're not going to get the stuff that is a 60% damage kind of situation. People are going to try to fix those internally. I'm making up numbers here. It's going to be the very serious, we can get away with it. Can we, and people will start negotiating, as you're pointing out, Don. If I'm going to sell my company anyways, if I can move this off of my plate anyways, this is the direction to go. What I think is interesting is that point, that's when you start considering an asset purchase versus stock purchase. And you start getting into the idea of, if I just keep the liability and I sell you the assets, you're still getting none of the liability. The problem is, number one, you've kept all the liability with yourself in the end, and that's hugely problematic. Number two, you're still giving the policy that caused the problem in the first place. So that problem does continue to exist. So 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, but I'm open to ideas, different perspectives. Then we come back to the compensation clawback piece. Like I mentioned, they are talking about what the requirements are. And as I pointed out, it's you don't want to give a bonus for people who don't satisfy compliance performance requirements. And that includes things like, so actually have a compliance program, which you will not see the DOJ wants you to have that. Have disciplinary measures for employees who violate applicable laws. So again, are you taking it seriously? Are you actually holding people responsible for non-compliance? For example, one of the most common ones I tend to see is when your highest performing salesperson is the one who is quote unquote giving bribes. And now you're going, well, they're doing so well. I wonder if we can just train them to not do this. And you go, that might be problematic. I did an interview with a guy who was the chief sales officer for a pharma company, went served 2 years in jail for it. It's a 4-part interview. If you guys want, I'm happy to send you the link to that as well. But he was like, the company culture was push, push, push. And we didn't care what we said as long as we sold the product. And that is the culture that the DOJ and the OIG wants you to fix. You're seeing that not only in off-label marketing, but the bigger area you're seeing that right now is the opioid crisis. So again, you're seeing a lot of pharma companies, for example, that made opioids or opioid-like substances trying to sell. And we're seeing a lot of pushback from VC companies, PE companies going, I don't know if I want the risk that goes along with this. Stan, you've had some experience there, I take. Not yet. Okay. And again, you want to also, we always talk about the stick, but we should talk about the carrot. So those people who actually demonstrate full compliance and full commitment to compliance, you might want to incentivize that as well, which is an interesting angle. I haven't seen too much of that. It's sort of expected to be compliant, but maybe you want to explicitly make it something that's positive. The other thing I start thinking about is, okay, we talked about the DOJ and the OIG. We should talk about the FDA itself. I mean, that's the piece everyone thinks about when they think of regulatory compliance. You could be talking about drugs, devices, cosmetics, food, and pharmacy, each of which have their own regulatory pathway. If you are buying a company, what you want to be aware of is this idea that, yeah, just because you're bringing a drug to market doesn't mean it has to go through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 studies. You could be, for example, a compounding pharmacy, a 503B manufacturer, and just bring the product to market tomorrow. You could be a 361 HCTP, which is a type of biologic, and again, you literally bring it to market tomorrow. You could be, until last weekend, you could have been a lab developed test and just brought your product to market. The FDA came out literally this past weekend and said, we're going to start enforcing the medical device laws around lab developed tests, and we can have a whole discussion on what that means. But the point being, if you are looking for immediate returns, it might make sense to go, do these people understand the regulatory pathway they're going to use? Can they bring the product to market quicker? Alternatively, you might go, I just want a deeper moat so other people can come in. And are they appropriately filing what's called a PMA or filing a 505B1 or the like? Essentially, do they have a strong enough moat saying we can keep other people out? And that gives us a certain level of exclusivity. All of which are great, all of which go to strategy, all of which go to valuation, and goes to your thesis as the VC company or the PE company. Again, we talked a little bit about this, but this is the plan, do, check, act cycle. Make sure that you're continuously doing this. You'll find, and I find this more often than not, where people think it's a straight line. You plan something, you do something, you check something, and then you act, and that's it. You've moved on. You have a quality program. It's a continuous self-feeding loop that you have to demonstrate that you have a quality program that fixes things. From a manufacturing standpoint, you can look at, for example, quality, production, facilities and equipment, lab controls, materials, packaging, and labeling. This alone is multiple people's full-time jobs. Dawn talked about clinical research. In the context of clinical research, what are the big issues that they're finding? I guess it's this one. Inadequate monitoring. The FDA says that that's a huge issue. Failure to get investigator compliance. So are your doctors doing what they should be doing in the context of clinical research? Submitting progress reports. Are they actually submitting that? Providing adverse events and notifying the FDA or investigators or IRB about problems. Are you keeping track of the drugs or devices that you've given to investigators? Failure to obtain investigator agreement. So your 1572 may not be appropriately signed. Failure to obtain FDA or IRB approval. You're continuously updating your protocol. And I can keep going. There are a series more, but the general takeaway is there are a series of issues in the context of sponsor considerations, and the FDA expects you to have all this under control. If you're buying a company, make sure you do a little bit of a deeper analysis. Make sure that they have appropriate controls in place over clinical research. And this is just at the sponsor level. We could have a whole different discussion if you were a clinical trial site. There are a whole bunch of other issues. Now you're looking at decentralized studies, brings up a whole set of other issues. You're looking at remote monitoring, whole bunch of additional issues. You're looking at real world evidence, brings up a whole bunch of other issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you're looking at marketing, this is kind of interesting to me because everyone thinks it is just the FDA, and that makes sense. But from an FDA perspective, you're talking about drugs, you might be talking about OPDP, but same exact time, you may be thinking about CMS, and CMS will fall under OIG, just like FDA will as well. But you might be thinking about the Sunshine Act. If you are thinking about the OIG, you may be thinking about the kickback laws that we talked about earlier. So there are a variety of issues when it comes to marketing. Which issue are you talking about? How deep are you going to go? I want to thank a lot of people, by the way. I know they stayed on for an hour. I'll try to move through a little bit quicker. We're almost there. I know, Zoe, you kept 90 minutes, but just being respectful to other people's time. From a privacy compliance standpoint, there are a variety of sort of analyses you could be looking at. There is are you going to be looking primarily at the US, or are you going to look ex-US? Are you going to look at just federal laws, or are you going to go into the state laws? Are you going to look at medical versus non-medical data? All of which will play a role as to which pieces you look at, what scope you look at. Then the question becomes, are you going to look at data privacy? Are you going to look at data ownership? Are you going to look at cybersecurity? Cybersecurity is something that the FDA is taking very, very seriously right now. I remember a few years ago, the VP Dick Cheney was going in under the knife. They had major concerns about whether someone can hack his heart. And that was hugely problematic. I see a lot of companies, for example, talk about, oh, we want to buy this company because they have really great data. Well, do they own that data? And they may not. So there's data privacy, which is separate from data ownership, and you need to be aware of that. And you need to look at the agreements to evaluate whether you can actually go into it. State laws, you can actually talk about data ownership, but one of the simple things is, are the passwords for the companies are you going to get all the passwords you need to be able to look at data? And you might find that your agreements were company specific, and there is no successor ability to look back at the information you thought you bought. And then you actually come back to creating a summary of findings. You want to, as I mentioned, you want to have the scope. You want to outline what you did not look at. What did you actually find, and what documents you reviewed? That, to me, is a short version of your summary of findings. Then you look at the actual contract post due diligence. Obviously, once you've done the due diligence, you're going to look at the actual contract itself, and you're going to start looking at the post integration phase. In the contract drafting, you primarily will land up impacting the definitions, the data, and a few other spaces. So for example, you want to look at the definition of health law. How deep will you go? You want to look at data. Is that separate from intellectual property? Typically should be. It almost never is. Are you going to look at data ownership and data access, which are two separate issues? Are patients involved? And this can actually implicate what's called the beneficiary inducement considerations. Are there any physician ownership issues which can implicate Stark and kickback? Do you have appropriate Sunshine Act disclosures? Don talked about clinical research. What's interesting to me is people talk about registering studies, and that's great. There's a whole, and doing the studies properly, which is great as well. What people don't know is that clinicaltrials.gov requires registration. Failure to appropriately register. Zig, thank you. Thanks again for coming on as well. Cheney got his implanted Medtronic device while he was working as a field engineer in Maryland. So we know people who are personally involved in that process, I guess. What I want to talk about is in the context of clinical research, there's a whole bunch of rules around clinical trial data disclosure, which people don't even know exist. I've done a bunch of work in that space. One of the interesting things about that is that if you do not disclose your study results as you're supposed to, the penalty is $10,000 per day per study, which adds up real quick. I've been involved in companies that had, I think it was 3,000 studies that had not been appropriately registered. Luckily, those fines are few and far between right now, but they exist. And I don't know if I can add up that number quickly enough. $10,000 per day per study. Then you start talking about the post-integration process, and you're going to have a overall compliance program. How are you going to bring your two companies together? bring the appropriate stakeholders to the table, define what your risk-based plan of action is. Everyone goes, can you fix this? Well, we've got to start slow. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Which part of the elephant are you going to start from? And generally speaking, both DOJ, OIG wants you to start from a risk-based perspective. You want to have a plan for reporting updates for key stakeholders. So again, you want to have a process showing that you have this entire post-due diligence phase under control. And then again, plan to demonstrate compliance, so using audits and the like. This was really my entire presentation. I'm happy to dig in deeper, happy to answer questions, but you guys have been interactive, and thank you so much for doing that. Any questions, comments?
Thanks, Darshan.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Stan. Thank you, Susan. Thank you all for participating.
Yeah, can I just, I don't think I heard you mention, maybe you did, post-market surveillance, which is a really, really, really important topic.
Yeah.
And you know, and again, from the point of view of an acquisition, is the potential company to be acquired sufficiently aware of its post-market situation? And the other thing, you mentioned cybersecurity, but this is momentous because the FDA is now, in theory, enforcing the guidance document that they have now made fairly final. So it's time. Cybersecurity is here.
Absolutely, 100%. And I did briefly mention pharmacovigilance and the like, but I appreciate you calling it out and talking about it further. So thank you. 100% I agree with you, Stan, on both those fronts. And you are actually seeing it more and more. I find it interesting that the FDA is taking on its guidances, but I don't know if the FDA has the wherewithal to be able to demonstrate actual compliance. So what has been your take on that, Stan? Do you feel like the FDA is the right organization to look at cybersecurity?
Well, you know, there are organizations, even our, you know, our very standard classic in the devices business, Underwriters Laboratories, UL.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, they have a cybersecurity arm and they can essentially do an evaluation. I think what's prudent is you can't sort of toss a bunch of stuff at the FDA or any other regulator and say, hey, is this good enough? You need to know it is good enough.
Right.
And it needs to be baked into your culture from the beginning.
Yeah.
And then, you know, certainly the FDA's and the FDA has a practice of hiring, you know, not just their own staff, but they bring in consultants to do evaluations. So,
and you see that with USP, for example, as well, USPDI for a lot of API stuff as well. So absolutely. But yeah, I think what you're pointing out is a really important thing, which is I think the FDA is developing its own techniques and its own knowledge, but in the meantime, they'll probably land up relying on a couple of other organizations as well. Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, Kamna.
Hey, Darshan.
Yes.
A question for you from just a business point of view. Today's macro, you know, it hasn't been the best year. Obviously, you know, we had that, you know, IPO whirlwind back in 2020, 2021.
Yeah.
Obviously the slowdown, mergers, acquisitions,
Yep.
right? The dry powder sitting there, but not a lot of deals happening.
Yep.
What are you, I mean, I know what I'm hearing on Bloomberg, right? The investors have to start doing something, will, you know, start doing their due diligence end of the year and start in 2024. What are you seeing, hearing, or feeling from your side?
I'm mostly seeing, I've seen the same slowdown I think everyone else is. I see some real smoking deals. So every so often I'm seeing the ones that how should I put this? That have real problems that people have to get out immediately. Those deals are still happening. I'm not seeing as many of the bigger issues, the larger transactions. I'm not seeing as many of those happen. I'm also seeing people digging under unusual rocks. I can't get into it because of confidentiality, but I've seen $50-60 million transactions in places where you didn't have $50-60 million transactions. So I think that people are going to be changing. I think the other thing is going to be changes in the law are going to cause some consolidations. So this recent LDT guidance I was referring to that came out this past weekend, it has to cause some major upheaval. And the reason it has to cause some major upheaval is every lab in the country was developing its own test. And the FDA, quote unquote, practice enforcement discretion, which means that we won't prosecute if it's just a small lab doing its own thing for its own patient, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's mutated into one lab doing it for millions of patients all over the country. And the FDA finally said, okay, enough. And that means that these labs either are going to have to go get approvals, they're going to have to sell themselves, they're going to have to something. So I think these types of regulatory changes are going to cause big upheavals. But as you said, there's a bunch of dry powder sitting around, and people aren't willing to light the match yet. So sort of push-pull, if you will. So there are going to be good deals, but I don't think it's going to resolve to at least second quarter. I just don't see it.
Beacon is the premier executive networking organization serving the Mid-Atlantic region. To learn more, go to beaconforlife.org.